Good evening, dear listeners of the 18th edition of Semana de Letras do CPAN. Welcome to the second conference entitled Self-Translation and Orature, Political Paths Towards Decolonizing One's Mind. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Janice Inês Nodari is a doctor on literary studies by the Federal University of Paraná, and she has been an adjunct professor on the bachelor's degree in literature English at UFPR since 2012. She teaches English literature and translation. Her doctoral thesis provides an overview of new post-decolonial studies by contextualizing the production of a Kenyan author. Her research interests are towards self-translation, self-writing, and space and place in English language, fiction, and poetry. She writes short stories and has texts published in anthologies in physical and digital format as well. Today she's going to talk about self-translation and oratory from a decolonial perspective. Please join me in welcome Professor Dr. Janice Inês Nodari. Welcome, Professor.
Good evening, Flaviani. Thank you very much for your kind words. I also greet the ones who are following us on YouTube channel. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. And it's my pleasure to talk about the topics that Flaviani has just introduced. I'm going to share with you a few slides so that I can have my presentation in a more organized way, and so that you can already write down the questions you may have on any of the issues that I will raise tonight. So the title of my presentation is Self-Translation and Orature, Political Path Towards Decolonizing One's Mind. And this presentation tonight is mostly based on the research that I conducted in my PhD dissertation. I hope you can enjoy, and I hope you can share some of your insights on these two topics. Well, in order to have the presentation in a more organized way, so that you know where we are going to, I intend to explore a few concepts that surround the two topics of self-translation and orature. I will refer to a few theoretical assumptions that provide the basis for studying these two topics, especially in translating literature. I will inform on a few writers, well-known writers from different nationalities, so that you can maybe research a little bit about them and get some more information on what they produced, what topics they explored, and so on. And I intend to finalize the presentation on presenting a few issues regarding decolonizing one's mind, because that's my sole purpose when I started researching this topic in my PhD, and it keeps on being my purpose in life, both in writing, translating, and even other topics. But before we start exploring self-translation and orature, I found that it's useful to distinguish prescriptive studies in translation and descriptive ones, because they might interfere with the view that people have in regards to what they are reading. For prescriptive studies in translation, equivalence was a key element, and it was the main purpose whenever conducting a translation activity. And prescriptive studies have been very useful whenever we refer to machine translation. And I have provided here a few examples of machine translation that you might have already resorted to, such as Google Translate, Babylon, Microsoft Translator, Can10, DeepL, GeoFluent, and there are others. It is also useful for translation memory, because many of these tools and some CAT tools as well use translation memory and need to resort to specific terms in order to provide the best translation possible for a given text. Examples of CAT tools or computer-aided or computer-assisted translation would be MemoQ, SDL Trados, Marcat, Omega T, MemSource, MateCat, and there are many more. As I said a few moments ago, these different tools used to aid the work of a translator resort very much to prescriptive studies in translation. And their main goal is to find the most accurate, the most precise term to present as corresponding one for translating a text, translating a phrase, translating a word. But we know, if you have already had the experience in translating texts, we know that it depends a lot on the context in order to find which is the most equivalent term for a translation to work. And in that sense, I would say that descriptive studies in translation provide the best solutions. The main reference in terms of descriptive studies in translation is by far the scholar Gideon Toury. And his main contribution to this area was a book under the title Descriptive Studies in Translation that he published in 1995. And in that book, he mentioned and actually he advocated that equivalence is relative. It depends on the context and on a series of other aspects that a translator should bear in mind. For instance, whenever we are translating literature, for example, we need to consider what is the role a certain language plays in that specific culture or book, for instance. Whenever we are translating orature, and I'm going to explain in a while what this concept referred to, we also need to consider the context, other aspects involved in speech, such as rhythm, such as dialect, such as irony, even figures of speech and different intonations that a person uses. We also need to consider cultural history, and sometimes this was an aspect that was not taken into account in prescriptive studies before. And we could even separate the two, this concept into being those culture and history that varies a lot depending on what language we are considering for translation. Descriptive studies have shown to be especially useful whenever we consider audiovisual translation. So, in order just to exemplify how to translate TV series, how to translate songs, how to translate conversations, how to translate documentaries or movies in general. And it is also especially useful whenever we consider interpreting. Sign language is included here. So descriptive studies have by far provided more contributions to the practice of translation than prescriptive ones, especially because sometimes we may find the definition or a certain term, an equivalent term in Portuguese and in English dictionary, bilingual dictionary, but depending on the context, that was not really the idea that wanted to be communicated. Well, as I said, and it was the title of my presentation tonight, the main concepts that I intend to explore here with you are self-translation and orature. And I will resort to the definition provided by Christopher White that was referenced by Helena Bandin. And Helena Bandin is a scholar from the University of Bologna. And she has researched and has provided many useful articles on this concept, especially self-translation. It would be when the author of a literary text, mainly, completed in one language, subsequently reproduces it in a second language. Well, this definition might have informed the very first studies on self-translation, but it is not one devoid of controversy, because maybe, and there are examples in literature that provide this, maybe a writer started writing a literary piece in one language and then moved on to a second language. It was not then a subsequent production, meaning that it was first written and finalized in one language and only then translated, self-translated in that case, to a different one. But I'm going to elaborate on this concept later on. The following concept that I would like to explore as well is orature, because we tend to focus a lot, especially in the academy, on the concept of literature and what contributions we can have in literature, and what literary theory has to say about a literary text, how it was written, what forms its core, or even resort to literary criticism to provide some background for analysis. But orature goes beyond the written text. And I'm going to resort here to a definition provided by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. For him, the major elements of classical orature would be riddles, proverbs, stories, songs, poetry, drama, dance, and myth. So based on the examples he provided, we can see that this concept goes beyond the word and goes beyond the written word for sure, because it refers to aspects that could be translated from one generation to the following one, and only orally, only verbally, not in written forms. According to him also, this classical orature is like the other aesthetic products of the imagination, the pictorial and the sculptural, for instance, and have also simultaneously nourished the imagination and explained the universe, helping humans to come to terms with it. And this definition is very comprehensive. It's almost all encompassing because it provides elements that make us refer back, for instance, to our myth, to the stories that we've learned about the origin of the universe, the origin of certain concepts, certain ideas that are passed on from generation to generation. So this definition here is a much more comprehensive one. Well, but as I said before, self-translation is really a practice that requires more empirical works, more empirical studies, and there is still room for these in the academy because it's a well-spread practice. But that first definition that was provided by Christopher White, which is the subsequent writing of a translation of a given piece, is not one that encompasses the different practices of self-translation that we find in literature. And I'm going to provide a few examples of writers, well-known writers, that practice self-translation, that write in two different languages. But first, let's make this concept a little bit more complex. Self-translation, according to Helena Bandin, is the process by which a bilingual author transfers his or her own literary or non-literary work from one language to another. In this definition, notions of source language and target language are blurred due to the fact that the author is presumed to be perfectly competent in both languages, and either of those languages can be the source language or the target one. And it makes much more sense if we consider writers such as, for instance, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, because in his life, he started writing in English because that was the language that he majored in, and he became a professor at University of Nairobi in the 60s, in the 1960s, and remained there as a professor until mid 70s, 1970s, until he was arrested for having written a play that should be performed by peasants, not by actors or intellectuals. And it was a play that criticized the colonial imperialism that was dominant in Kenya, because Kenya was a former colony of England until the 1960s, 1965, if I'm not mistaken. Well, he, at first, in the very beginning of his career, wrote in English first, and only later, when he got into exile, first in England and later on in the United States, where he's living nowadays, translated to Kikuyu, his mother tongue, the one from his tribe. And he decided to make that, to self-translate his books, he said, because he wanted to make his literary pieces available to his countrymen. And that's an honorable purpose to have in life, at least in my opinion. Well, many authors may have even be unsure about which language is their dominant one. And that is also a case, for instance, if we consider, although he's not normally referred to in self-translation studies in general, but this could be the case, for instance, of Samuel Beckett, who was bilingual in both French and English and wrote sometimes in one language first, sometimes in the other language first, and would translate his own pieces of play, his own plays, into these two, would write and translate into these two languages. Maybe he wasn't sure of which was his mother tongue, the dominant one, because he was so proficient in both. And according to Lopez Gusseni and Elena Bandin, it's because he was living probably in this in-between area. And this concept here, this concept of in-between, reminds one of Homi Bhabha, for instance, and his contribution in The Place of Culture, Local da Cultura, which is a very interesting book that explores this feeling of not belonging to one culture or not belonging to two different cultures, especially because of colonial issues. These writers, and I continue here with the quote by Elena Bandin, inhabit the space that exists between two languages and two cultures. They do not belong to one language group, but to both. And at the same time, they are part of both languages and cultures, and as a result, they have to live with the tensions inherent in such a situation. They have a hyphenated identity since they live in the slot occupied by a hyphen. That hyphen is also present in the word self-translation. And I found this definition a much more encompassing one than the one that was mentioned before, which was very simplistic, just writing in one language and then self-translating into another one. And as I said, this practice is much more common whenever we refer to literary works, not so much whenever we talk about academic productions or technical translation, for instance. So this is the case of a few writers, as I said before, and some examples are mentioned here, and I'm going to show a few pictures of them in a few moments. There are writers in Spain that self-translate. They first write in Spanish and then self-translate to French or German or English. There are examples in Canada of writers that first write in French and then self-translate to English or vice versa. There are examples of writers that do this in India for sure. There are examples of writers who do these in African countries. And as I mentioned, the most common and most discussed example is certainly Ngugi wa Thiong'o, especially because he writes in English first and then self-translate to Kikuyu. And nowadays he's doing the opposite movement. He's writing first in Kikuyu and then self-translating to English because he has a political agenda, and I'm going to explain which one it is in a while. There are examples of writers in Argentina. One example that might be the most famous still to this date is Ariel Dorfman. If I'm not mistaken, he's still in a sort of self-imposed exile in the United States. He is of Chilean and Argentinian background and writes about the dictatorship in Argentina in his literary works. There is the example in Brazil of João Ubaldo Ribeiro, and also the example of Paulo Henriques Brito. João Ubaldo writes fiction, Paulo Henriques Brito writes poems. Nowadays, I believe he got influenced by the translation he made of Elizabeth Bishop in her poems on Brazil. I'm not really sure about this. It's certainly food for thought and a topic for research. But he's nowadays not only writing his poems in Portuguese, but also translating them into English. And there are just a few studies to this date on this topic of his practice of self-translating his poems. There are also writers in Ireland who self-translate. There is the example of Karen Blixen in Denmark that spent some time in Kenya. She would write first in Danish and then self-translate into English because she was aware of the publishing market, and this is a key information also in order to understand these writers. There is the case of Haruki Murakami in Japan, and there is the case of Xiaolu Gu in China. Not to be the first one. China actually has another peculiar story that I would like to share with you more in the form of an anecdote that I became aware of just a few days ago. There is a language that was created and used only by women in China under the name of Nushu. And it was a secret language used by women, and they would use this language to write notes that they would exchange only among them, among women, or they would write and put these different writing in paintings, in embroideries, in their clothing. And this is part of the orature scope of studies, because those are materialized not through only through language, but also in different means of communication, in that case, painting or embroideries. And well, if we consider China, there are 10 major languages there and about, I guess, over maybe 80 dialects. I'm not really sure about the number. But Nushu was not a language dominated by male speakers. It was not known by it. And UNESCO declared it as international heritage in 2002, if I'm not mistaken. And the last speaker and user of Nushu died in 2004. So there is this movement nowadays to recover the written registers of this language that was secretly known and shared just among women. It is, to this date, known as the only language that was created and used only by women. So it would be a pity to let it just be forgotten in history. And well, this is just as I said, an anecdote to show how much self-translation is involved, because what these women would do with this language in China would be self-translate, use information and share using different drawings that would be understood only by them. Well, here are some pictures of the writers that tend to use self-translation as a tool, and for different reasons. I would mention Haruki Murakami and João Baldo Ribeiro probably as being the ones who used to self-translate his books, their novels, their books, sorry, because they were aware of the publishing market. So they knew that they would be better understood and would sell more books if they would write in English. That's the same case with Karen Blixen here that you see also. But it's not the case with, at least not as a first intention, with Ariel Dorfman, who is pictured here, right below Haruki Murakami. Because as I said before, Ariel Dorfman would have this practice of self-translation in order to write about dictatorship in Argentina. So he was more involved and had as a first purpose to make that context known in different countries. And the language chosen for that was English, because then he became an exile, he became exiled in the United States and would write and publish his books in English over there. We have the case here of João Baldo Ribeiro, and in case you are wondering which books he self-translated, there are two actually, and then he gave up that task because it was really very challenging. It is to self-translate, and there are questions about how much is self-translation, how much is improvement of the text of the first version that you're going to make available to other people in a different language. João Baldo Ribeiro first wrote Sargento Getúlio in 1971, and then self-translated it in 1978 as Sargent Getúlio. And he did the same with Viva o Povo Brasileiro, which was first published in 1984, just towards the end of dictatorship here in Brazil, and which he self-translated to English in 1989, and became known under the title An Invincible Memory. And I found it really interesting, to say the least, that he chose such a title in order to make the book and the story of the Brazilian people during the the dictator period available in English for other cultures. The case with Ngugi wa Thiong'o, as I said, is pretty much similar to the one of Ariel Dorfman. While Ariel Dorfman was more concerned about making the heavy years of dictatorship in Argentina available to a different public that was not aware of what was going on in Argentina at the time, Ngugi wa Thiong'o decided to write in Kikuyu, as I said, to self-translate his writings in English to Kikuyu in order to make his books and his essays, especially political essays, but also linguistic essays, available to his people in Kenya, the ones that would try to keep alive this heritage of speaking in a tribal language that is not so well known around the globe. Just out of curiosity, Kenya has 42 different tribe languages. Besides, and apart from those 42 tribe languages, they have as not as their mother tongue, of course, but as the official language used in the country, English, because it was the language of the colonizer, and also Swahili, which is a lingua franca in the eastern part of the African continent. Swahili, just for you to have an idea, is spoken in Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, parts of Somalia, even Ethiopia and Kenya. And it is the main language used for commerce and for trading purposes. It's not really English. English is just used whenever they want to trade or to establish different connections with countries overseas, for instance, India or China, or again, England, not only India, but also England. So there are different purposes that explain why this Kikuyu and English are used. Well, and why self-translating, one may question, one may wonder why they feel this need to self-translate. Why not choosing one language that is that sells the most in the publishing market, which would be, for instance, most examples here, English, and then maybe second place, Spanish. Why self-translating to minor languages, or not writing in one's mother tongue and choosing a second language to write about? And well, the reasons are as many as I could think of. Actually, I would say that these are just a few. They are not. I did not finish the task here. That there might be more reasons to explain why these writers and others self-translate. It has to do with issues on identity, because most of them resorted to this practice of self-translating or using another language that they had or showed good command of in order to write their literary pieces, their political or linguistic essays, or their poems, whatever was the case, whenever they were in exile. So they were displaced from their native countries. And sometimes this exile was self-imposed, or it was, well, there was no other way out. It's the case of, with, for instance, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. He has no choice. He cannot go back to Kenya. The only time whenever he and his wife decided to pay a visit to the country in order to visit relatives and talk about, well, he was prepared to provide some lectures on what he was doing in the United States. He is a professor at UCLA in Irvine. He teaches African literature and creative writing as well as translation. They were brutally assaulted and decided never to go back to Kenya anymore. So maybe this need of trying to learn another language, or making the writings available in two different languages, is in order to broaden their audience, and also in order to understand what was going on in terms of their identity and their pursuit of a new identity, especially because they were in this in between area, gray area, I would call it, because if you are not Kenyan, or if you're not English, and you have good command of both languages, which one will you choose to express your ideas in? There are certainly political issues involved, as I mentioned very briefly in the examples I provided. There might be a political agenda, and I identify that very clearly in Ngugi wa Thiong'o's production. And there is also this attempt of decolonizing one's mind, because whenever you can make your ideas known, they were they were published in English, for instance, and then you can, and they were praised, and you may have received some prizes and some honors because of that. You want to talk with your fellow countrymen, so you make what you wrote, what was applauded, available for them as well. Um, and this issue of self-translating arises as a consequence of a process of colonizing different cultures and different countries. And one needs to understand how colonization takes place. And we don't need to go far in order to understand how this takes place, because we just need to take the example of Brazil, for instance. We can consider that colonization takes place and really finds a way to establish itself if this triad is in vogue. And normally colonization starts with commerce, or having capitalism as the engine to make it move. But it also has the aid of religion sometimes. And we have this in Brazil, for instance, with the Jesuits arriving here and establishing by force the use of a different language among different indigenous tribes. The same happened in many African countries. The same happened in other places throughout history. And also, we have the establishment of colonization by means of education. Whenever you make what is available to you only available if you speak a certain language, and that is not the language of the 42 tribes that you find in Kenya. That is certainly the language of the colonizer, English in that case. And yes, we could have the same happening with French or Spanish or Portuguese in different countries. And Thiongo was pretty much aware of this, so much so that he said that the canon, and in this case here he's referring to the literary canon, forces the body, not only the literary canon, sorry, but also the canon that is used um, to make people, I wouldn't say accept, but maybe not struggle so much or battle against the establishment of colonization, because it was by force. The canon here as being a means of artillery. The canon forces the body, and the school fascinates the soul. And he was one also in he was so much aware of this that when he was criticized by Chinua Achebe, another intellectual from the African continent, from Nigeria, he was aware that he also, I wouldn't say subdued, but um, maybe adapted to this learning of the English language in order to survive, in order to find the means to survive. He became an English teacher later on at the University of Nairobi, and was regarded as a very influential intellectual. Not only him, but he was one of the main intellectuals at the University of Nairobi, and he acknowledged this strength that colonialism had over intellectual minds. And it was sometimes a fascination of the soul, because you could reach and you could have access to so many things, because you had this language working as a means for you to get better education, for you to get better clothes, for you to get better food. In his view, as he says also in 1986, in the book Decolonizing One's Mind, I have the book here just to show the cover to you. It's this one here. Oops. He says that language was the most important vehicle through which that power fascinated and held the soul prisoner. So he was aware of the power that the English language, exercised on him and on his fellow people. He also was aware, and later on said in his essay Global Ethics, that language and literature were taking him and the other intellectuals further and further from themselves to other selves, from their world to other worlds. And this was not at all 100% positive. It had some issues, it had some problems, and it made them live in that in between gray area in which they had to make choices which language to use in order to communicate their ideas. And how can someone then decolonize one's mind? Well, there are certainly different ways of doing that. And well, one of them, and if not the main one, would be through education. But education in the sense of knowing one's history, knowing one's ancestral, and sometimes even how the ancestral knowledge can talk and inform new knowledge. And this is normally not taught at schools or at the academy. it is normally just passed on from one generation to another through oral stories, through myth, through embroidery, through different practices. It is a way of course, raising awareness. And whenever someone is aware of the power that a foreign language exercises on someone's life, and I'm certainly aware of the power that English exercises in my life, it is well through English that I find the means to survive, to pay my bills, for instance. But it's through that awareness or that raise of awareness that someone can really understand what is his or her role in society and maybe find different ways of making his own language known or understood. It was certainly this that happened to, but no, it was not, certainly not the only reason, but it was certainly what happened to João Baldo Ribeiro in translating his books, Sargent Getúlio and Viva o Povo Brasileiro. And it just came to my mind that there are other examples for these. One of them being the controversial Polish English writer Joseph Conrad, who wrote Heart of Darkness. And he wrote that novella, because it's a very short piece, in English first, although he was of Polish culture and language. He made a, a chosen, an informed choice to provide that book in English first, and it is full of phrases, and it poses a real challenge to be read and understood because of the way he writes, he uses that English language. And it, in a similar way, Ngugi wa Thiong'o also uses, some people prefer to refer to it as broken English. And I see a political agenda in that. Because, for instance, if we consider the way he presents the information, we see that it's not really proper English, but we can understand because we share English as a second language, not as being the one that you use the most or the one that we use to convey the issues from the heart. Also, one can decolonize his or her own mind through access to financial means. And some of these writers that use the practice of self translation certainly resorted to this technique of self translating because they found it the most useful way to reach a wider audience and to make their message understood by other individuals, and maybe then find some people they could share some ideas with. So it was a very a very informed decision, and they knew how the publishing market would work, because certainly books that are written and published in English, they would sell more than the ones written in a minor language, because you don't have the audience to pay that, so to pay even the cost for publishing those books. It happened also to Karin Blixen. It just crossed my mind now. The Danish writer who spent some time in Kenya, and she wrote the novel Out of Africa that became a movie, if I'm not mistaken, with Meryl Streep. And she made that choice of writing in Danish first, but then she would self-translate to English, um, because she had in mind a wider audience, one that would read in English. And at first, she had the audience of England in mind, not the audience from the United States, because she knew that in order to get into the North American market, it is a struggle. It really requires some effort and also having the best connections. Um, One way also to decolonize one's mind is certainly to build meaningful connections within one's community and the outside world. So it's acknowledging these in between position, but also seeing that you can do more with that. You can establish connections with the outside world, but not forget the mother tongue, the one that you were raised with, the one you sing maybe parabéns a você or happy birthday, the one that you talk about your feelings, the one you share your ideas with other people. And again, it's a two-way road, because at the same time that you are being aware of the work that a foreign language exercise in your life, you make informed choices of using in certain contexts, but not using all the time, maybe. Well, these are just a few ideas on how to decolonize one's mind, and of course, there are more possibilities of doing that, in terms of what you can do um, when writing and when sharing ideas and when sharing thoughts. Because in terms of orator, sharing thoughts, sharing ideas, singing together, learning different crafts was also seen as orature. And what are the implications of these practices if we consider, for instance, the machines that we use or that we resort to as translators? And just to remember those examples that were used in that were mentioned in the very beginning, such as translation tools, cat tools, or machine translation or memory tools, because they can only expand and receive more terms in order to facilitate our work as a translator if we have more studies, empirical studies, that would provide these terms or that would provide these concepts that could be inserted in the machine. Because again, the machines only work because we inform those machines. And it just crossed my mind that one good example of a writer that has included some Igbo terms in her writings is Chimamanda Adichie. There are terms in the Igbo language that she uses for which there is no corresponding term in the English language. So whenever you read her books, you find these terms, and sometimes you may wonder what they mean. This is the classic example of the presence of orature in a literary piece. And in terms of the publishing market that could make these literary pieces available to the greater audience in English or any other language, it just crossed my mind that whenever I mention the triad of colonialism, um, commerce, education, and religion, the publishing market, and especially I will not name here the publishing companies, but some of them, they make choices of which writers to publish in English in England, so that the public would have access to tales and stories that referred back to Kenya, to South Africa, and to Nigeria. So the writers were chosen, and maybe they were not the ones that could really provide a real contribution in terms of understanding the cultures that would be found in those colonies. And it's again, it's a rule of the market. It's capitalism that dictates the rules, that dictates which books are going to be published. I've been seeing some positive movements, especially from minor publishing houses. One of them is not to be regarded as a minor anymore. It's Granca. I have one book here that is publishing short stories and making them available to the English audience. And again, they are still trying to break this rule established by capitalism, that only a few books should be made available to the bigger audience. Well, and there are certainly more examples of this, but the practice of decolonizing one's mind should really start with becoming aware that sometimes we have access to certain literary pieces, to certain pieces of information, because there is another structure, a bigger, a more solid one that dictates what is that could be made aware to us. Yeah, that would be it. And then I finish here, just a few minutes before 1 hour. I show here to you some of the references I used, and I could talk briefly about them. One is Maria Alice Gonçalves Antunes. She's a retired professor of the State University of Rio de Janeiro. Her book on self-translation and exile, especially, if I'm not mistaken, it's around here. Yeah, it's O Respeito pelo Original. In this book, she mentions the case of João Baldo Ribeiro, Ariel Dorfman, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o as being the main examples of writers who self-translated. But as we can see, this array of writers just expands because there are more writers for different reasons following this practice. There is also Ashcroft, Griffith, and Tiffin. These scholars provide key concepts on post-colonial studies. There is Elena Bandin, who is also concerned about self-translation as a means to decolonize one's mind. And this reference specifically, it is a paper, but it refers to Ngugi wa Thiong'o and provides him as being a great example. There is also a book here in which I have a contribution of my own. It's a paper that derived from my doctorate dissertation. It was published by the Federal University of Goiás. There are several contributions here from writers, scholars, and professors from different universities around Brazil, under the title Romance Africano, Tensões, Conexões e Traduções. There is also Ifu Tuan, who provides a very useful distinction between space and place. And of course, Ngugi wa Thiong'o with Global Ethics, the essay that I translated it's over there, in my doctorate dissertation, Decolonizing the Mind, and also on the abolition of the English department, in which he advocated for the end of the studies of English literature at University of Nairobi. He was very bold in his proposal. There is Gideon Turi in descriptive translation studies, and Lawrence Venuti in terms of the scandals involving translation, especially the case that I mentioned earlier, that was that some writers were chosen to be published in English while others were not. I finish here and I say thank you for your attention, and I'm open for questions now if you happen to have any.
Thank you, Professor Nodari, for your amazing talk in this conference. It is, in fact, a very important topic, and we are glad that we are able to discuss it today. We do have some questions in the chat. I will read some of them. The first one is from myself. Dr. Nodari, may I ask your opinion on the famous quote, traduzir é trair? Do you think this phrase is able to explain how the translation process is not only about the final product, but also about the information the translator did not choose?
Sorry. We have this quote following us, actually haunting us since I believe the beginnings of time. Because many translators might have resorted to this to change, to embellish, to improve certain pieces of writing. And I do not refer only to literary translation. It may also be true whenever we talk about technical texts, but I don't believe that's the case. Normally, what I see and whenever I talk to fellow translators is that we try our best. We try to render in a different language what we are reading. So we try to build a bridge. And I would say that sometimes we are good engineers in trying to build those bridges between two different cultures, between two different languages. And sometimes our bridges are not that good. So those who have access to what we translate might consider that we betrayed the original message. But maybe it was just a lack of proper tools. And by lack of proper tools, sometimes you could even say there wasn't the translator was not proficient enough. Maybe that's a possible reason, or maybe did not have access to the culture, because whenever we refer to the Portuguese language, we need to bear in mind that Brazilian Portuguese is different from the Portuguese spoken in Angola, which is different from the Portuguese spoken in Macau, which is different from the Portuguese spoken in Portugal. So how can we really build that bridge and just bear in mind that it's the same thing? The final product will be considered a betrayal, but sometimes it's only because we did not have proper tools to resort to. And I do not consider that we translators do that, at least not intentionally. It might have been the case in some old eras due to financial reasons, due to religious reasons. I don't know, but I don't see that as being something that guides our practice anymore. I believe that we try our best, but sometimes we are not just successful.
I see. Thank you very much for your answer. We do have other questions. They will appear on the screen. This question is from Cadu Araújo. In general, are people more open or not for self-translated narratives?
Well, that's an
Do you think
interesting
that?
question, Kadu. Oops, sorry. Okay. Well, that's certainly an interesting question, Kadu. Um, I would say that sometimes the general public is not so open for self-translated narratives because there is always that suspicion that maybe the writer had one intention in the first text that he wrote, and he changed that intention or improved the text in the second version, which is the self-translation. But I do believe that, again, I do believe in good intentions. So maybe I'm being too naive. I don't know. But what I see is that people do not tend to welcome self-translated narratives. But it is certainly a useful tool to make certain stories known in different cultures. And if we consider the publishing market here in Brazil, for instance, well, we have a lack of translations into English, Spanish, French, German, Japanese of our Brazilian literature. People don't know about Conceição Evaristo, they don't know about Machado de Assis, they don't know about José de Alencar, they don't know about Graciliano Ramos, because we don't have these books translated into different languages yet, which is a pity. And of course, some of these writers, they are not alive to carry out that activity, and some of them are not willing to do that because they do recognize that it is a very heavy burden. It was the case with João Ubaldo Ribeiro. He did acknowledge that it was a heavy burden, so he just self-translated 2 of his books and gave up. He left that activity, the translation, to be carried out by a professional, a translator. And well, I believe that it's really, it depends. It varies on the public. I can see that some people see um, the positive aspect of having a book self-translated, but some people believe that it's something that was modified. So I don't know. It really depends. I have read, and I just keep on wondering that maybe it was just the choices that I chose to read and that were self-translated, Portuguese and English, that there was some sort of embellishment in the text. So it wasn't a nice experience for me. But I do acknowledge it as being something sometimes necessary, because otherwise people from different countries wouldn't have access to what is going on in certain countries, since some of these languages are minor languages and just spoken by a few individuals.
I see. Thank you very much again for your kind answer. And we do have another question from Kadu. In your opinion, is the process of code switching more common in self-translation, or is it a fallacy?
Yeah, again, that depends on which book we are analyzing. In the case of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, I can see code switching all the time. And I was reading his books written in English, and I could identify that there was something off, that it wasn't working properly. And it was certainly the influence of the grammar of his mother tongue, which was not English, it was Kikuyu. And it works in a different way. It has different grammar, um, it has different a different alphabet. It doesn't even have the letter Q in the Kikuyu language. And at times, when I had the chance of spending some time in Kenya, I lived there for over a year. I learned a little bit, just the rudiments of Swahili. I could also see the structure of the Swahili language whenever he was writing in English, because there is a certain order in the presentation of nouns, and I could see that order being followed, especially in his essays, not so much in his novels. So I believe that yes, they do switch codes at times, and sometimes they write because they have this intention of having it published or translated in a different language. But I haven't really studied in depth this specific practice here in different productions or in different writers. So I cannot really exemplify with more writers. Can only say what I could identify while reading Ngugi wa Thiong'o's book.
Thank you, Professor. We don't have a question. I would like to congratulate you for your amazing talk and also for the questions we're receiving, since we are going to discuss a lot more about it. And we have a question from Alicia. Dr. Nodari, during the self-translation process, the author is able to modify the original meaning based on their own understanding. Do you think so?
Oh, that's another interesting question. I wouldn't know how to answer, Alicia. Thank you for your question. I believe that they do change, they do modify the original meaning at times. I wouldn't say that it happens all the time. And I have in mind the example of Paulo Henriques Brito and his poetry, his poems actually, and again the case of Ngugi wa Thiong'o. At times I could see that, for instance, Ngugi wa Thiong'o was modelizing his speech a bit more because he was writing in English. And I could feel that, especially considering translation studies and a functional approach to translation, which is the contribution of Christian Nord based on Katharina Reis and Hans Vermeer, that they had the audience, he had the audience in mind. So he was modelizing, because if he had put in a very blunt, in a very straightforward way, he might not have been understood. And the use of modal verbs in the English language is something advisable, especially whenever you are trying to convince someone of your arguments and you are trying to convey your ideas in a clear way. So I believe that, yes, in some of his essays, especially the ones concerned with his political position and his linguistic view of the English language, he might have modified the original meaning based on his own understanding. It is a very interesting topic to be researched and to contribute to self translation and translation studies a bit more. Um, and it lacks more empirical studies if we consider other writers that are self-translating themselves, being those like, for instance, Ariel Dorfman or Haruki Murakami, or even João Ubaldo, if different analysis would be carried out over his fiction, and even the case with Paulo Henrique Brito. So there is still room for research. If we could compare, since we are proficient in the Portuguese language, and some are proficient in the English language or in the Spanish language, if we could compare that. But again, there is a point that goes beyond the curve, I would say, uh, and that is Samuel Beckett, who used to write both in English and French. So I don't think that he was changing the meaning. Maybe he made the choice of writing in one language, being that French first, for instance, because he could see that in French he would convey his ideas in a clear way. I don't know. Again, room for thought and room for research.
I see. Thank you very much for the answer and also for acknowledging how important this question is. And we do have another question, who is for myself again. Dr. Nodari, when a very specific term does not exist in the second language, do you think writing footnotes may help the reader understand the complexity and the relevance of it?
Thank you very much for your question, Flaviani. Well, I'm suspicious. And I don't know if you can really trust on my opinion, because I love footnotes. I love them. I always look for the footnotes, and I know that I'm going against the current, and I'm going 100% against the publishing market, because the publishing market tends to see the use of footnotes as patronizing the reader, maybe calling the reader not willing or not, I don't know, smart enough to go and search for himself. But I see the use of footnotes as a plus, as a way to show that the translator was really after the information and tried to find the best way possible to explain certain terms that, as you well said, do not exist. In Portuguese, we have saudade. There is no translation for saudade in English. There might be in Spanish, soledad. I don't know if it's really 100% equivalent to that feeling of missing and longing for home, but there isn't a term in English for that. So how would you translate it? And then again, just recalling an example of a North American poet who spent a few years in Brazil, Elizabeth Bishop. She was aware that there wasn't a term for saudade in English, and she wrote the book Saudades do Brasil. It's the Portuguese title, and the poems are in English. And she wrote about the context, the social struggles that she would witness while living in Rio de Janeiro in the 50s, and I think well into the 60s also. And sometimes you don't have the term. There are lists and lists for curious people to see that there are terms with no equivalent because they are so culturally limited in terms of, I wouldn't say limited because limited might give a wrong idea, but culturally circumscribed in a certain context. And you don't find an equivalent or a term that would be convey the idea in 100%, let's say. So you would still leave some room for doubt. And I just love footnotes. When I was writing my PhD dissertation, I included, I don't know, I doubled the number of footnotes that I found in the original essay. I translated Global Ethics and Weep Not Child, an essay by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and his first novel. And I doubled the number of footnotes that he had included himself to explain things, to explain references to William Shakespeare, to explain references to different artists that he knew, both in the African continent and in the European continent. So I don't know, I love footnotes. I would say it's a pity that, okay, of course, we would spend, the publishing houses would spend much more paper in order to include those pieces of information, but they certainly make the text more interesting, and they show the effort that the translator put into that task. So I enjoy them. I pro footnotes all the time.
Thank you very much, Professor. I do also love footnotes. That's why I asked about it. And we do have another question from Milena Paula. She asks, Dr. Nodar, do you think self-translation is the better option when it comes to personal texts such as diaries and notes?
Tough question, Milena. Very tough one. Um, I can see that, and again, there is room for research. We need more empirical studies on different writers and different, maybe psychologists, maybe historians, maybe, I don't know, artists in general that would follow this practice of self-translating their own writings. We still lack some studies on this. I'm not really sure if I can answer the question in terms of pointing out that it's the best option ever. Sometimes we we might need, and I'm talking this from the creative point of view, because as Flaviani said in the very beginning, I also write. I write flash fiction and short stories. From the creative point of view, I don't see myself as being able to self-translate my work because it would require some detachment, some distance, in order not to get involved and in order not to do what normally writers who self-translate tend to do, which is improve the text in the other language. I would like to see what solutions a translator found for the terms that I used to convey certain ideas or to write certain metaphors or to explore certain thoughts. And I would be very curious to see what a translator would come up with. And I don't find myself equipped or maybe prepared to do with my own writings out in a different language. So yes, sometimes I believe it is an informed choice, but as a writer myself, one that is just starting, I wouldn't do it. I don't feel I'm equipped to do that with my own writing. And diaries are so personal, right? So it would really be, you would have to sign a contract. um I wouldn't say a written contract, but you would have to sign a mental contract with someone else before providing access or um, making your writings available so that the person would translate for you. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe sometimes it's safer to self translate because you are in charge, you are in control of the whole process.
I see. Thank you very much. I think that the self-translating of your own text is very important, but I also think that your opinion about translate your own works is very interesting to see the point of view of an artist, but also of a scholar. So I think it's very good, and it's very amazing how this conference is going. And we do have another question, which is the last from Cadu Araújo. With so many countries banning neutral language, could self-translation be considered a tool of resistance if used by the author? I think that's a very good question, and I'd like to hear your opinion on it.
Well, yes, that is indeed a very, very interesting question, Kadu. Thank you very much. A tool of resistance. Considering the past decades, and considering that, for instance, many African countries, they only got their independence in the 60s, 1960s and 1970s and 1980s, their independence could be seen. We can say that a language is neutral, although some people believe that it does not carry ideology. I believe that language is full of ideology, and when you choose one specific language to communicate with other people, you are conveying something. You change your behavior, you change the way you organize your ideas, the way you organize and present your thoughts. So I don't believe in neutrality. I believe it's always a tool of resistance. And yes, choosing to speak and to publish in English, since we are in the academy, is also a way to be well read, to convey our our studies, to communicate our studies, to share ideas with other people, to find maybe possible points of contact, so that we can bridge, build bridges, and learn a little bit from the others, as well as teach something about ourselves. And yeah, certainly, self-translation is and could still be used as a tool of resistance.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Professor Nodari, for your amazing talk in this conference. I'd like to congratulate you for your talk and also for your enthusiasm answering the questions and to bring some awareness on this topic, and also from the theoretical framework you use it and all of the things you said that was very much important. Thank you for your presence, for accepting the invitation to participate in Semana de Letras. And I'd also like to invite all of you, all of the listeners, to sign the attendance list on the line chat, and also to sign the list. And the LALAEC, thank you all for the listeners and Professor Nodari for your presence. And we'd like to invite you for next activity that will happen tomorrow in the same YouTube channel. We will have a discussion entitled Fica Espanhol, Resistências e Perspectivas no Mato Grosso do Sul from 10 to 12 a.m. In the Mato Grosso do Sul time, time zone. And we'd like to thank you all and see you tomorrow. Good night, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please
Flaviani, and thank everyone. Okay. Thank you, Flaviani, and thanks everyone who managed to follow on YouTube. It was a pleasure to talk to you and to answer all these questions. And I would like also to thank Professor Carlos Plácido for having invited me to give this lecture today on a topic that I enjoy. I particularly enjoy, which is translation. And that's it. Yes. See you all around. Thank you, Flaviani, for being here and helping me out with the questions.
Thank you again, and thank you all
good
the
night.
listeners.